The Retire Your Ride program is an initiative of the Government of Canada and the Clean Air Foundation and is supported by the Auto Recyclers of Canada. The program is designed to remove high-polluting cars from the road and reward the owners of those cars for doing so. The Retire Your Ride program is designed to responsibly recycle 1995 and older vehicles. Approximately 50,000 vehicles will be retired annually across Canada until 2011. And that's where you come in. Auto recyclers are partners in pollution prevention. Environment Canada has made a commitment to the Federal Treasury Board that every recycler involved in the Retire Your Ride program will have at least one inspection, because they've made a commitment to the people of Canada that people who are processing the end-of-life vehicles, that those cars are being processed to environmental standards. The Environmental Code of Practice is a national code, and as we'll learn a little bit, most of the materials or most of the legal requirements are all provincial legal requirements. And that creates a patchwork across the country, and while we are in Ontario, we had to write the Code of Practice that is as equally valid in Newfoundland as it is in British Columbia. So there are some specific elements that will be adjusted to one province versus another depending on what the legal requirements are. Some of the key things that I hope that you heard and we're going to emphasize in through the day is the concept around pollution prevention. I assume that this is not a new term for you, but prevention, whether it's in health and safety or environmental management, prevention is the real key, because if you can prevent a spill, then you don't have to clean it up, you don't have to pay someone to clean it up, you don't have to pay someone to take the hazardous materials away. It just will save you time and money. So anything you can do that prevents spills, leaks, or pollution is ideal. The second thing is, if you can prevent spills from getting on the ground, next time it rains or snows, it's not going to track the material into the groundwater or off-site. I hope that you embrace that concept, because it really will improve the efficiency of your yard and prevent spills and leaks. There's just no question with that. It's not a concept, it's actual fact. The other aspect that I really want to emphasize today is there are direct benefits for adopting the concepts of pollution prevention. It saves money by reducing environmental costs. How much does it cost to dispose of a drum of sludges and soils that are contaminated? $500, okay? How many drums a year? 2, 3 a year you might have to discharge? There's $1,500 right off your bottom line. So if you can implement pollution prevention that reduces that, and I don't know your yard, but maybe if you can drop it by 2 barrels a year, there's $1,000 straight into the pocket. It increases efficiency in worker conditions. And the other aspect is it reduces liability. Every province in Canada has contaminated sites legislation. It's all called different types, but everybody has contaminated sites liability. Okay? How many people in this room own the property that they work on? Okay, the majority. How many people lease? Okay? Whether you're leasing or you own, you're still responsible. So when your lease is up, the landlord may require you to clean up. So if you can prevent spills, then that just saves you a cleanup at the end of the lease, and potentially a costly battle. So some of the potential benefits of accreditation. It should reduce the number of inspections from regulators. This is not a bad thing. However, what we have in British Columbia is we have an environmental certification program that includes about 150 auto recyclers. We have gone to the Ministry of Environment. We've outlined what our program is. We show them all the results. And the ministry comes by, does occasional audits to make sure we're doing our job correctly. And then they focus on other issues, the other people who are not in compliance with the regulation. The most important thing is that we have gained their trust by doing a good job, and then they focus their attention on someone else, which is really what we want them to do. It also will eliminate inconsistent regulatory rulings. I'm not sure how many times I've heard that when one person comes onto a property that they would say one thing, and the next inspector, when they come on, says another thing. What we really want is a consistent message for the industry. And this is because the environmental rules are quite complex, and it takes time to work through and decide how it applies to your business. So we really, by developing a code of practice, we interpret what the legal requirements are, we agree on how it's to apply to auto recyclers, and then we inspect to the code of practice. If the regulators have a problem with how we interpret the code of practice, we change the code of practice. It's very simple to do, but at least we're all being judged on the same criteria. Reduce environmental costs. As we talked about, it's $500 to discharge or to dispose of a barrel of sludge. If you can reduce that by having to pump out your holding tanks less, by preventing spills, etc., that's going to save you money. Reduce spills and cleanup costs, reduce liability on property. It saves your investment. Most of the people here are owners of their property. That's your retirement plan. That's the real asset in your business. And so every time a spill goes onto the ground and it's not cleaned up and it goes into the soil, that's damaging your property. You wouldn't damage your cars on purpose, so let's not damage the land on purpose. Another aspect is it reduces your banking and insurance costs. I believe it was in 1999 or 2000, the Canadian Association of Bankers and Insurance Companies published a report that said that companies with good environmental management systems, and what we're talking about today is part of an environmental management system, are well organized, they're lower risk, and hence they should have lower banking costs and insurance costs. Because banking costs and insurance costs are based on risk. And if you're a lower risk, then you deserve to have lower charges. So actually, I have had recyclers that have got lower interest rates on their line of credit because they're accredited to the Environmental Code of Practice. And they've also had or obtained banking when they couldn't have got banking previously. In other words, they were able to get financing because they were accredited to the Code of Practice. The other aspect I think is important is you obtain professional advice at a fraction of the cost. The Retire Your Ride program is paid for by Environment Canada, so when we do inspections on your yard, it doesn't cost you anything. In British Columbia, I believe the cost is around $600 to go through the environmental accreditation course. And that means that they can call the person doing the accreditation anytime during the year, ask questions. They do the inspection that provides these other benefits. We come on site and we do a tour through their place and we say, this is great, this is not so great. You might consider this, you might do that, and then we're gone. Okay? You could not get an environmental consultant to come and do that for $600. They would, I mean, by the time they answer your call and decide to come out, they're already up to $1,000. So because it is a quantified, simple system, then we can keep your costs down. The other aspect is avoid unnecessary capital costs. How many times do people come into your place and say, I've got a great product for you. You know, it's enzymes and it eats up the oil, and you just put it into your holding tank. As I had one guy, he had a oil water separator, and the salesperson encouraged him to buy a emulsifying agent with enzymes in it. Okay? He had to buy this stuff. So he was putting it into his oil water separator, and the emulsifying agent breaks up the oil into little particles, right? And now it's a discharge to the environment, which nullifies what the oil water separator is supposed to do. So now he's buying a product, costs him money, to nullify the purpose of his oil water separator. He doesn't do that anymore.
Each of the sections in this presentation are referred to as modules. This has been Module 1. After each module, you'll be invited to complete a questionnaire before moving on to the next module. In the second module, we'll be talking more specifically about the types of hazardous materials we're dealing with when we recycle end-of-life vehicles. Hazardous materials are banned from landfills and would contaminate soils and water bodies if released into the environment. Because even small volumes of hazardous materials can pollute the environment, all vehicles to be recycled must first be decontaminated. The careful and safe management of hazardous materials is one of the most vital responsibilities in automotive recycling.
Auto recyclers play a vital role in the recycling of materials from vehicles. And I find, having worked with you guys for the last 10, 12 years, is this point is missed far too often. You're considered junkyards, and that's not appropriate. We want to reuse parts. We want to recycle materials, and we need this industry.
Did you know that 1 gallon of used oil can contaminate 1 million gallons of water? When properly recycled, motor oil can be reprocessed and used in furnaces for heat or in power plants to generate electricity for homes, schools, and businesses. Fuel lubricants and antifreeze are toxic to our water and soil if they are released into the environment. Antifreeze, transmission fluid, power steering fluid, and gear oil can all be recycled. The main ingredient in antifreeze is ethylene glycol, which is derived from natural gas, which can be distilled and filtered to almost new condition. Anti-rust, anti-leak, and detergent additives can then be added to make new antifreeze again. Refrigerants are used in automobile air conditioners.
We got two types, R12 and HFC 134A. R12 was banned, I believe, in 1996 in Canada, so it hasn't been used since that date. Hopefully it's been replaced prior to that. R12 is a nasty, nasty compound. Okay, this is the ozone depleting compound that when released to the environment has an impact on the ozone. The other aspect that I think people forget is it's also a very powerful greenhouse gas. So for every kilo of R12 that's released from your site, it's equivalent to approximately 10,000 kilos of carbon dioxide. So that's 10 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so how much R12 would be in a typical car if you had one? A couple pounds? Okay, so a kilo. So if you don't process it properly, you're contributing approximately 10 tons of CO2 equivalent to the atmosphere, plus all the ozone depleting impacts. So we forget that it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. And the cars that we're focusing on are 1996 and older, where we would expect maybe 10, 15% might have R12, if they have anything at all. Something along those lines. So we're targeting in this program cars that may have R12. Very, very important. Now, HFC 134A is the product that substituted for the R12, and you'll see it in late model cars. The good news is that HFC is not an ozone depleting substance, so that's a good thing. It's also a greenhouse gas. Approximately 1 kilogram of HFC 134A is equivalent to about 1,300 kilos of CO2 equivalent, so 1.3 tons. So better than R12, but still important to capture. Now again, when we go through the code of practice, refrigerants are the most regulated product that we have in our list because of the potential impacts to the environment. So don't skimp on how you process refrigerants. And we'll go through what the code says around that. But just keep that in the back of your mind.
Mercury is a toxic metal often used in switches to activate convenience lighting in the hood or trunk of a car.
Mercury is ubiquitous in the environment, but in the mercury switches, a small amount can contaminate a lot. This has 0.85 of a gram of mercury. And apparently, if we released it into a 20-acre lake or a 10-hectare lake or 8-hectare lake, it would contaminate the fish for 1 year, and you couldn't eat the fish. So that shows you how toxic it potentially can be. So just be careful when you recover the mercury pellets, and make sure that you don't break the aluminum housing that it's in, and that you store them and send them off to the switch-out program or equivalent program, because I believe Saskatchewan has their own program, is that correct? But in Ontario here, we have the mercury switch-out program, which started here, so support it and send it off to the Clean Air Foundation, and they will dispose of the mercury in an appropriate manner. Lead, 2 or 3 sources of lead. Obviously, we got the lead acid batteries, but we also have the lead on the tire rims and on the battery cables. So just take them off. Hopefully you can sell it. I think everybody will buy lead these days because it's an important commodity.
By now, most people are familiar with the serious toxic effects of lead exposure on human health that prompted the removal of lead from paint and fuel products. Automobiles are now the #1 source of lead pollution in North America. Lead is a valuable raw material that can be recycled. Acid can be separated from batteries prior to smelting, filtered, and then passed on to specialized recycling companies. Millions of tires from cars and trucks are thrown away every year, and we've all seen the sickening images on the news of toxic fires burning for days, causing the evacuation and contamination of communities. Discarded tires can also hold water and act as breeding grounds for mosquitoes and rodents, promoting the spread of disease. 20 years ago, the market for scrap tires barely existed. Now, tires can be retread, and tire parts can be recycled and used in everything from the bottoms of sandals to speed bumps and rubber-modified asphalt for roads and athletic tracks. Windshield washer fluid contains the poison ethylene glycol and is toxic and flammable. Proper recycling of windshield washer fluid prevents soil and water contamination.
Let's go through the key federal and provincial laws. The key environmental federal laws are the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act. Everybody talks about TDG because you can't transport hazardous materials on roads, and that's the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act. As a technicality, that only applies to the federal roads, and there's only a couple of those in the country, and that includes the Trans-Canada Highway, and there's equivalent legislation that apply to provincial roads. Okay, but we all talk about TDG, Transportation of Dangerous Goods, and that's why you have to placard the vehicles and they have to be manifested. That's where that information comes from. The third key federal law is the Federal Fisheries Act. Simply put, it just prevents you from putting deleterious substances into fish-bearing waters. Okay, and most streams and ditches in probably this province would be a stream as defined by the Federal Fisheries Act. Don't want to be putting stuff into a storm drain that goes to a stream because now you've just violated the Federal Fisheries Act. Key provincial laws. Most provinces have what's called the Environmental Management Act, and I believe that's in Ontario as well. There are a couple of provinces who have different types of legislation, but it does the basic same thing. And we'll go through the 3 key elements that every piece of legislation covers. Basically, the Environmental Management Act prevents discharges to the environment. Okay, there's a prohibition. You can't have discharges to the environment without a permit. Under these omnibus acts, there are a variety of different regulations. And one of those regulations will be something that will focus on ozone-depleting substances. That's your refrigerant. That's R12 HFC 134A. Those products, R12 and HFC, are some of the most regulated products in the province or in Canada. Another key provincial law is what's called the Hazardous Waste Regulation. It basically ensures that hazardous materials are removed, stored, transported, and disposed of appropriately. The other aspect, as we'll learn, is the spill reporting regulation. Every piece of provincial legislation requires you to report spills above a certain level. If you spill more than 100 liters of waste oil, you have to phone it in. Whether you clean it up or not, has to be reported. And the fifth piece, a key piece of legislation in provincial laws are the contaminated sites regulations. Okay? This puts the onus on the management of hazardous materials and the cleanup of spills and leaks on the operator and the owner. So for those people that are leased, the owner of the property carries some liability as well. So that's why it's probably got specifications in your lease about how you will leave the site when you are done. Again, I really want to emphasize that these are just general names we put down for the legislation. In Ontario, it may vary depending on it, but every province will have these types of regulations.
The following description is for the general elements of the Code of Practice for Retire Your Ride. Because every automotive recycler is different, there may be some site-specific code requirements that can only be determined during a site visit. Many aspects of the code also recognize that different regulations exist in different provinces. The Code of Practice is based on the existing legal requirements for automotive recyclers.
One of the requirements of the Retire Your Ride program has a limitation or a restriction on the selling of engine parts. Taillights are fine, tires are fine, mirrors, seats, but engine parts. And so when the person's coming around for inspection, they're going to ask, you know, where do you put the Retire Your Ride vehicles? And do you take parts off? And he or she is going to ask, can you show me? Because one of the things the inspector always does is, can you show me? So find a way, and what they're going to do out in the West is they're just going to spray the engines on the Retire Your Ride program, and they're not allowed to touch them.
The Code of Practice is designed so that the average automotive recycler will be able to achieve the code without difficulty. Over 150 automotive recyclers have been through this type of program, and only the poor operations have problems meeting their requirements. The code was designed to help the average automotive recycler understand his or her legal requirements as it applies to their operation, as well as integrate best practices that will help improve efficiency and profitability.
Pollution prevention can save you money. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to places for the second and third time, and the first time I went there, they grumbled a lot, because they said, oh, I got to change, I got to do it this way now and that way. Then when I come back in a year, they go, oh, and it really helped because, you know, we're more efficient. Now we process the car only once, then we put it in the back, and we don't have to clean up and stuff like that. It can save you time, and it can save you money. It really, really can. There are 7 elements included in the Code of Practice. These 7 elements are considered wastes. We know that the provincial regulations define what is a waste, and we've identified 7 hazardous materials that need to be managed on site. And that includes the removal, the storage, the transportation, and disposal of those hazardous materials. Okay? And hence, we must have proper management both under normal and emergency conditions. So we got the waste oil, fuel, other lubricants, etc. We have antifreeze, refrigerants, mercury switches, lead and lead acid batteries. You don't want lead on your property. Tires, not because the tires are a hazard unto themselves, but because they can cause a problem under emergency conditions. There are 2 legal aspects associated with the management of hazardous materials. The first is contamination on a site. Every province in Canada has contaminated sites legislation, and vehicle dismantlers are responsible for the remediation and cleanup of spills and contamination left on a site.
The second legal aspect is when the hazardous materials leave your property under controlled or uncontrolled circumstances. Runoff during precipitation events and snowmelt can transport hazardous materials to streams and sewers and is regulated. If your site is located next to a fish-bearing stream in a high precipitation area, then you are a high-risk site, and the control of runoff is an important concern. If your site is in a low precipitation area with no streams nearby, then your site is a low-risk site.
The other aspect that the code will talk about are transport licenses for transporters. Remember, under the transportation of dangerous goods, it has where the shipment originates, who's transporting it, and where it's going. So you have a responsibility to make sure that the person who's transporting those things is licensed. And why is it important to use a licensed transporter? Well, for one, they're insured. They dump their load of batteries on the 401, their insurance is going to cover it. They're licensed to do it. They're also bonded. So they put up a bond to the Ministry of Environment. So if they dump a load of batteries in the Don Valley River, they're going to get it cleaned up. You don't have a headache. There's 3 key things you got to do. You got to make sure you know what is a waste and what is a product. You have to remember that it's illegal to discharge those wastes to the environment, and that you need to manage those wastes in normal and emergency conditions. And that includes document and records management, registration potentially with regulatory agencies, storage, transportation, and reporting. And if you take that message away, then you read through the Code of Practice and you assess your yard to the Code of Practice, you're good to go. In this module, I'm going to walk you through the inspection process of a recycling facility. There are 7 sections that we normally cover. The receiving area, dismantling area, hulk storage and crusher areas, wet parts storage, hazardous materials management, equipment and infrastructure, and administration. In each of the areas, I'll try to point out the key elements of the Environmental Code of Practice and show you how it applies in the real-world situation. Then you'll be able to evaluate your own yard and prepare for an inspection. Here we are in the end-of-life vehicles receiving area. As you can see, this is where the vehicles are dropped when they are brought in from the tow truck or the flat deck. And this is where spills can occur. Obviously, no dismantling can occur in this area because it needs to wait until it goes into the dismantling shop. The kind of things that you want to look for here are there any spills on the ground? And most importantly, are there any drip pans around or absorbent pads to either prevent spills and leaks or to clean them up? So here we are in the dismantling area. Code of Practice requires that the dismantling area be a little bit higher so that flooding doesn't occur. It also has an impermeable floor surface so that fluids that are spilled onto the floor can't get into the groundwater. Has a great roof, as you can see here, and it also has this grate here to prevent any spills from getting out from inside to the outside. We like to think that the dismantling area could hold a minimum of 25 liters of fluid in the event that it's spilled on the ground. All the fluids are removed in the dismantling area, such as the oil, the antifreeze, the windshield washer fluid. The batteries are taken out, the lead weights are taken off, tires are taken off, and the refrigerant is usually removed in this area. This model has a mercury switch in the trunk, and so he just has removed it. And as you can see that the mercury switch is in a little plastic relay switch, and now he'll take that out and put it in a little bottle and send it off to the mercury switch out program. So when the vehicle leaves here and goes to the hulk storage area, there are no hazardous materials in the vehicle. So here we have an example of a great hulk storage area. As you can see, there are no spills. The spills have either been prevented or they've been cleaned up. And we can tell that they've been prevented because all the hazardous materials have been removed. The engine's been not only drained, but it's been removed. The transmission's not only been drained, but it's been removed. The windshield washer fluid has been drained. As you can see, the refrigerant's been removed. The master cylinder's been drained. The battery's been taken off and the ends have been clipped so that there is no lead out here. And as you can see, the car has been prepped and all spills have either been prevented or cleaned up. So this car is held here until they've finished taking all the parts off, and then it goes over to the crush pile. Okay, so here we are at the crush area, and recyclers do one of three things. One is they will have a crusher on site, and they just will crush the vehicle and then have it hauled away to the steel recycler. In this yard, they have what's called a crush pile, and they'll bring in a mobile crusher, and a forklift will put the cars in the mobile crusher, and they're crushed and then taken away. Or the third option is recyclers, usually the smaller recyclers, will not have a crusher, and they'll just take the hulk straight to the steel recycling. Now, what I like about this this crush pile is you can see that the cars are well organized. They all have had their engines taken out. There are no fluids in there. The refrigerants have all been taken out. The mercury switches have been taken out. There are no tires. There are no oil stains in the water, and so that means they've been cleaning up after the crush. Elements of the Environmental Code of Practice is the storage of wet parts. Here we have a great example of the proper storage of wet parts. It's undercover, it's got a great containment system on the floor, and no fluids can get from here to the outside. Another thing that this area tells you is there's really no leaks on the ground, and that tells me that the wet parts here have been properly drained. So here's another reason this is a great area to store your wet parts. There's drip pans at the bottom with wood chips in there to absorb any oil, because we always know that even though they've been drained, there's always some residual fluids that have occurred. And then you can also tell that when a spill does occur, they've taken the time and effort to put some floor dry down to clean it up. It's a great example. Here's an example of some of the spill requirements in the wet storage area. Here's some floor dry. And as we all know, the leaks and spills are going to occur in this area because they have fluids in them, or they've had fluids in them. But it's always important to keep some floor dry around to clean up any spills. Keeping it neat and tidy also not only protects the environment, but it protects worker health and safety as well. As you remember, the Code of Practice requires that the engines be drained along with other wet parts. And here is a great place to store the engines because it's got a covered roof and a nice impermeable floor, and they also have provisions to catch any drips and leaks that may occur. You can also store the engines and other wet parts in the vehicle as long as the hazardous materials have been removed. Now we're at the steering racks, and again, as you can see, they're all plugged, and they have a great containment system, so no fluids from here are going to get to the outside. The other thing that's really important here is all the spills out in the walkways are cleaned up so that you're not tracking hazardous materials around the area and out to the environment. So here we are in the pressure washing area. As you can see, this is a great place to do pressure washing. The floors are all sloped in a little bit towards a holding area. All the sludge and fluids are contained within that area, and they would be disposed of as a hazardous material. The other aspect is it's inside, it's on a good concrete floor, and no fluids or overspray can get to the outside environment, and that will prevent spills and unnecessary cleanup. Okay, one of the important areas of the Environmental Code of Practice is the hazardous materials management. This means that hazardous materials are removed in the dismantling area, they're stored in appropriate tanks, and then disposed of as hazardous waste. So behind me we have the storage containers for oil and antifreeze. They're double-walled tanks, and they're held here until they're disposed of by a licensed transporter, and then those materials are taken for proper disposal. So here we are at the waste tire pile. It's very small in this yard because they remove the waste tires every 2 days. Normally a recycler may have 100, 200, 300, even up to 1,000 used tires that they're not going to sell on site. By themselves, tires do not pose a big environmental risk. However, if these caught fire and created an emergency, there'd be significant air pollution as well as water runoff as the fire department tries to put out the fire. So make sure your tire piles are small. Hopefully you can keep them under 1,000 tires and prevent an emergency condition such as a fire. One of the elements of the Environmental Code of Practice is the proper maintenance of equipment and infrastructure. As you can see, most recyclers will have a variety of yard vehicles, loaders, pickups, etc. And what we want to make sure of is the equipment is being maintained appropriately, and if it does cause any leaks or spills, that they're cleaned up. And as you can see, this vehicle is in good working order. There's no leaks occurring underneath it. There's no need to clean up any spills. So here we are at another piece of equipment. Again, it's in good working order. There's a hydraulic fluid that you might want to be concerned about, but nothing's leaking on the ground. And again, there's no leaks or spills here to clean up. This is where they would keep it overnight. And again, when you look around, there are no leaks or spills. So this is obviously showing that the equipment is kept in good working order. And now we're in the office. Administration is an important element of the Code of Practice. By administration, we mean documents and records management. There are two important documents to consider and keep on site at all times. The first is the license for the refrigerant technician. All technicians must be licensed by the Heating, Refrigerant, and Air Conditioning Institute. Keep their license on site. Second license that's important is the transport license for the haulers of hazardous materials. Now, by records, we mean the manifests and the shipping labels for the shipment of hazardous materials on public roads. Keep these records on site for a minimum of 2 years.
Hopefully you'll have a better idea of how the inspection process works. Please print out the inspection sheets and take the opportunity to complete a site survey. Make sure you have a pollution prevention plan and an emergency management plan in place. This will help you get your facility ready for the inspection and put you well on your way to accreditation in the Retire Your Ride program. All automotive recyclers experience leaks and spills. It's part of the business. It takes time to clean up leaks and spills, and it takes money to dispose of the contaminated soils and absorbents resulting from spills. As such, automotive recyclers should train their staff and modify their operations to prevent leaks and spills, establish spill kits, policies, and procedures to deal with the inevitable leaks and spills, and develop an emergency management plan before the emergency happens. Canada is a large country, and there are several different types of emergencies that could create a risk at an automotive recycler: vandalism, fire, worker error, flooding, earthquake, and tsunami. The first three types of emergencies are common to all automotive recyclers. Vandals can push over or puncture tanks containing hazardous fluids. Fire can create significant runoff of hazardous materials if containers fail during the fire. Air quality problems can be caused by the burning hazardous materials. Worker error includes your workers as well as contractors transporting hazardous materials generated on site. Many automotive recyclers may be subject to flooding. The location and geomorphology of the site will determine if your site is subject to flooding. Finally, earthquake and tsunami is a special concern on the West Coast. For these reasons, all hazardous waste regulations require some sort of secondary containment. Secondary containment simply provides a margin of safety to prevent the large spills of hazardous materials to the environment. Some yards are located close to rivers, lakes, aquifers, etc. A significant spill of hazardous materials in these sensitive locations will have a much greater impact. For example, some automotive recyclers are adjacent to fish-bearing streams. As such, they should consider their site to be very sensitive, and hence their emergency management plan should reflect this sensitivity. Once the automotive recycler has assessed the types of emergencies, the risk of their site, and the quantities of hazardous materials that could be spilled, they are ready to prepare an emergency management plan. The owner of the automotive recycler must know the reporting thresholds and post them.
What are the large spills? These are the spills that you really need to control. Leaks can wait, small spills can be dealt with immediately, but in large spills, there are 3 things your employees need to do right away. Okay? The first is mobilize the spill kits and supplies. I don't want to hear about people who are trying to figure out whose fault it was or whatever. There's stuff heading out the door. It's heading towards off the property. Let's deal with it and worry about the blame later. Second thing, make sure, do whatever they can to make sure the spill is prevented from leaving the property. And that's why I said make sure your spill kit is appropriate to the volume and the hazardousness of your area. Okay? We're in Medicine Hat and we've got big flat ground and nothing's going to go anywhere. You don't need the spill kit that you need if you're right next to a fish-bearing stream. Okay? Common sense. If that container goes, can I contain it? If the answer is yes, great. The third thing that they have to do is notify authorities and the owner. Okay? They need to contact you directly. Make sure that the people are mobilizing the spill kits and the supplies. But as owners, make sure their spill kits are adequate to deal with it, and B, make sure they notify you or authorities. A spill over 100 liters has to be reported. Antifreeze 5 liters, battery acid 5 liters. So you're not going to spill more than 5 liters of battery acid. Refrigerant is 10 kilos. So that's more than 1 car. So if you've got a container and somebody drops the container, knocks the top off, and it's being discharged to the environment, it needs to be reported. Now, what people do is they'll complete and fill out that form, make up some copies, and get them posted around your place. Because in an emergency, you don't want your employees to go in to pull out the binder, trying to figure out which tab it's at, and do it. Let's get the signs up there, grill it into them, maybe even test them. There is no real rule of thumb. Just make it sensible and common sense.
There are 5 basic steps that must be completed for a facility to be accredited for the Retire Your Ride program. The Automotive Recyclers of Canada has offered in-class training for the Retire Your Ride program from coast to coast in both official languages, in addition to this online version. The online training is available for those that were not able to take the in-class training, or for those recyclers that wish to review the training or have their employees take the online training. The training manual contains the inspection protocols that will be used by the environmental inspectors. Automotive recyclers are encouraged to conduct a self-assessment of their operation and make any necessary changes to conform to the Environmental Code of Practice for the Retire Your Ride program. The facilities will be inspected at no cost by an independent, experienced inspector that understands the automotive recycling business and is trained to the Environmental Code of Practice. The facility will be given some notice that an inspection will occur to ensure that the owner or manager is present during the inspection. The inspection should not take more than 2 hours. The automotive recycler will review the inspection results with the inspector, and if there are any non-compliances to the Environmental Code of Practice, the recycler and inspector will prepare a pollution prevention plan. The pollution prevention plan must adequately address the issues identified at the site by the inspector and must be signed by the recycler. The signature of the recycler means that the business is committed to address the operational issues. Approximately 25% of the automotive recyclers will be re-inspected to ensure that they are implementing the commitments outlined in the pollution prevention plan.
There are three scenarios for recyclers. The first is full accreditation, which means you meet the full requirements of the Code of Practice. There are no snags on your inspection, okay? It's totally okay before the inspector gets there to go through and do the inspection yourself. That demonstrates that you understand what the requirements are, and you can fix any snags before they get there. Totally okay. Normally, though, most people don't do that, and they just wait until it gets done. The second one is your conditional accreditation. There had been deficiencies, but your pollution prevention plan addressed them. Okay? You don't have to send off your pollution prevention plan to anybody to get approved, although it is a good idea to, when you come up with some of your corrective actions, so maybe you have to build a pad, okay, maybe you check with the person that did the inspection, say, hey, this is what I'm hoping to do. Does that make a lot of sense? You don't have to, but it's not a bad idea. And the third thing is not accredited. We've shown examples of some people who have significant deficiencies and they cannot be addressed in the next 12 months. We don't want them in the program. Those people are the poorer recyclers, and we've seen lots of photographs of those. And we're only talking about 10-15% of auto recyclers. But for the purpose of the Retire Your Ride program, we only want recyclers that can meet the Code of Practice under the first two categories.
The benefits of accreditation are many and have been outlined earlier in this program. The Code of Practice combined with a credible inspection program will also free up time from the regulatory agencies so that they can focus their limited time on the non-compliant recyclers. When implemented, pollution prevention strategies will reduce environmental costs associated with your business, and that will prevent costly cleanup of the facility and make your business more profitable. Environmental accreditation has helped automotive recyclers access capital, obtain mortgages, and lines of credit with banks and lending institutions. Implementation of pollution prevention practices at the facility and the regular cleanup of leaks and spills that do occur will reduce the environmental liability of the property. Most automotive recyclers own their own property, and the preservation of the property's value is a priority. The Automotive Recyclers of Canada are committed to helping automotive recyclers understand the legal requirements for your province. ARC members and Retire Your Ride participants can receive ongoing support from ARC on any environmental question and how it pertains to your operation.